Good morning, family. Welcome back to another weekend of Summit Up Saturday. I'm Reverend Dr. Dwaylinda Alexander, and I'm so grateful that you have decided to pass by, whether it's on the YouTube channel, on the Facebook platform, IG, and hang out with me for a little bit today as we continue in our August series of the Devil's Playground. If you've been hanging out with us this month, you know we started out talking about insecurities, and on last weekend we dealt with accountability, specifically within leadership, and ways in which the devil can really and truly get busy with our insecurities and our mismanagement of those emotions that come with that, and allow us to interpret situations and relationships in a negative light, but then also how the insecurities within others can cause damage and harm in our relationships with them. Then dealing with accountability last weekend and leadership, as I mentioned, and how a lack of accountability can really cause the enemy to get busy within our churches, our ministries, even on our jobs, in leadership spaces, organizations that we may be members of. So we have been really digging in and having a good time looking at scriptures and texts that deal with these areas where the enemy can get busy. And then also discovering that sometimes the enemy that we're dealing with is ourselves. So I'm excited that we're continuing in week 3. If you saw the little hint that I dropped throughout this week, you know that we're talking about communication today. Communication. And we know anytime when people are present and there has to be something said or shared, verbalized, written, however the form of communication is, there is room for miscommunication. And that can be a thing that causes the enemy to get busy or causes what we call a devil's playground. So we're going to jump right in today. Again, if you're new here, welcome to the space. If you're joining us again, hey, do me a favor, like, comment, share. We like to hear from you. Give us some feedback on how you're feeling about the series this month. We got one more Saturday, y'all, and I can't wait to get into that last one. But let's jump in on today. So we're looking at a verse, Ephesians 4, verse 29. And there's like so many texts that we could have talked about, right, and used to dig into communication. But for this one, we're going to talk about Ephesians 4, verse 29. And I'm reading from the English Standard Version. And it simply says, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." That it may give grace to those who hear. If you ever played the game telephone, then you know that this game starts with a message that's told to the first person at the beginning of a long line or in a circle, and you have to whisper that message and pass it down and along everybody in the line or in the circle. And then the very last person is supposed to share out what the message is that they received. And if you've ever played that game, then you know that by the time the message gets to that last person, it is absolutely not what was said to the very first person when the game started. And oftentimes that's what happens in communication. I feel like it's very common these days, especially with most of our communicating happening via social media. They're happening on in posts on Facebook, on IG, on X. They're happening in text messages, emails. Oftentimes things get lost in communication because what the first person meant to say, what the first person said, didn't get passed along or interpreted in the same way that they communicated it. And it happens, I say, more so these days because when we communicate through text, through posts, through direct messages, there is no tone, there is no mood, there is no voice, there is no indication of how a person is truly communicating and the spirit behind the words that they're saying. So that leaves room for a lot of wonders, what ifs, and sometimes miscommunication and confusion. That I think that that's just a common thing these days. And so there are ways, of course, in which we can deal with it. We can always make sure that we are checking the tone of what we say and how we say. But then when we communicate in person, right, when we actually have conversations with one another, there are all kinds of ways that the message, the words coming out of our mouth can even still be misinterpreted because of our facial expressions, our body language, our posture. And so it's Do you really mean what you're saying? Are the words coming out of your mouth really what you're trying to communicate? Or are your facial expressions and your body language telling me something different? And so there's all types of room, right, for things that could be meant with positive intent to be misunderstood and misinterpreted. There's a book that I was doing some researching and reading about this topic of communication, right? And so I ran across this book, How to Communicate Effectively and Handle Difficult People. And it's written by Preston Nye, N-I. Now, the title, it gives off, like we're dealing with some negativity here, but the characteristics of ineffective communication that he talks about are really valuable, because you look at these 4 characteristics and you find ways in which to counter those and act in the exact opposite way, so that we can then get effective communication. But I think it's so important to look at what he talks about and what he lists out as these 4 characteristics. And then he also goes so far as to talk about what the consequences of ineffective communication are. And so very quickly, 4 characteristics of ineffective communication. First and foremost, you language plus directives. You language plus directives. I really felt like a friend of mine, she posted something today that was like right along the lines of this message. And I was like, I'm glad she said that, because that confirmed some things within me that I've kind of always leaned towards, that it's not a good idea to start a sentence when you're talking to someone, especially if you're trying to straighten something out, or if you're in the heat of a moment of a conversation, with, well, you need to, or you should, or, well, you should have, or you didn't do. It's this, or you need to do, especially that you need to. That's a tough one when you're dealing with adults and somebody feels like you're trying to tell them how to act, how to respond, how to behave, because we know in our flesh, the natural response is, I don't need to do anything, and now I'm not going to. That's what we do in our flesh. Y'all can deny it, but we do. Well, that's normally the response when we use this you language and lead with you language in communicating with people. And so I tend to try to be very intentional, even in my conversations, even in preaching, teaching, try to be very intentional about using we language as the counter to that. That instead of saying, y'all like to talk down about people, and y'all like to do such and such as, that's that you all, right? Y'all like to, no, sometimes we do such and such and such and such. Sometimes we should reflect and think about such and such and such and such. That's inclusive of me as well. So it doesn't come across as though the person who's talking or communicating is pretending that they're better than, or that they got it all together in a way that the person that they're talking to doesn't. So ineffective communication, you language plus a directive. Now, sometimes does you language need to be used in the general sense? Yeah, absolutely. But you want to try to lean towards that when you're talking about positive things, when you're giving accolades to a team, letting everybody know how awesome they are, or even an individual. Hey, you did a great job today. I really appreciated the way in which you did such and such, such. That kind of you directive is always fine. But when we know that we're having to have a conversation that could potentially leave room for a little rub, I call it a little rub, then we want to be careful about that you language plus directives. Second ineffective or characteristic of ineffective communication is using universal statements. You don't ever, you always, you never, every time, everybody, all of y'all. Listen, anytime we use universal and general statements and generalized statements to address a thing, we're not using effective communication, because off the rip, I'm gonna say it like that, off the rip, the statement's not even true. It's not possible that a person never does, or they always do, or everybody does this particular thing. There's always going to be a counter. An example that the author uses in his book was, someone could say, Preston, you never wash the dishes. And he could easily say, no, I washed the dishes that one time last year. That automatically negates this generalized statement of what he quote unquote never does. And we know if you've ever been in a conversation, been in a disagreement, been in a moment with someone, and they say what you never do, now you're ready and you're compiling. You're not even listening anymore to what they're talking about. You are compiling your list that's going to negate the fact that they just said you never. Or even if you're talking about a topic with someone and they say, well, everybody does that. That's just something everybody does. You're already now going to go on the defensive to compile your list in how, no, this is not something that everybody does. Basically, all you have to do to counter that way of ineffective communication is just make sure that you're not using generalized language. Talk from your experiences that, hey, this is something that I've experienced more than a few times. It's not all the time, but more than a few times, this is something that has happened. Can we talk about that? That's a more effective way to approach it. So then thirdly, being tough on the person rather than being tough on the issue that's being discussed. Or the way that he says it in the book, being tough on the person, but soft on the issue. And those are those kind of conversations where instead of talking about the issue that's on the table, it turns into personal attacks. And we 100% know the devil is busy when that happens, right? Because something was said that triggered an emotion, and now we've gone from having a conversation or dialogue to a full-blown argument. And that's not effective communication. That when we enter into conversations, and I think this is so big within intimate relationships and marriage especially, right? Had to learn. You have to keep the conversation on the topic at hand. We can't start talking about those individual things to point out fault in a person. We got to talk about the issue. Mature communicators talk about the issue. Mature communicators don't veer off from that because someone's disagreeing with what they're saying and then get into attacking the person. So now, like what Preston says in the text, instead of being tough on the issue that's at hand, we are tough on the person. That we are no longer talking about whatever we were talking about. Have you ever had an argument or a disagreement with somebody and you look up 10 minutes later and you don't even know what y'all were originally talking about because you got that far off on now going at each other rather than handling the issue? And then the fourth characteristic of ineffective communication that he talks about is invalidating feelings. And that simply breaks down to recognizing that that there are emotions that are surfacing for a person that we're having a conversation with. But now, instead of honoring that there are those emotions that are present, we discount those feelings, we belittle them, we minimize them, or we judge them. That's always going to cause some negative consequences of our ineffective communication. Anytime somebody tells you that you made them feel a certain way or a situation made them uncomfortable, we have to honor that. We honor their feelings. We don't try to tell them that, nah, that's not how that happened. Nah, that's not what that meant. For them in that moment, that's their real experience. That's their feeling. That's their emotion. And we honor it and we validate it. Because if we use language directives, if we use universal statements, if we're tough on the person rather than the issue, and then we invalidate a person's feelings, then we get three consequences. And it boils down to what he talks about as fight, flight, or freeze. His 3 F's: fight, flight, or freeze. I actually like to look at that as disagreement, disassociation, and then dissociation. I'm going to talk about the difference between those last two in just a moment. So quite naturally, if you're having a conversation with someone and you are ineffectively communicating, or if I'm in conversation with someone and I'm ineffectively communicating, then that disagreement, that fight, is going to be elevated because now I'm going to go into defensive mode, or you're going to go into defensive mode because you're feeling attacked. And so that's where we have that situation where we're not even dealing with the issue on the table anymore. We're talking about something that isn't even relevant at this point. Then the flight component to this, disassociation, is literally separating yourself from the situation, leaving the place, leaving the event. I'm not even going to be here to deal with this anymore. You got it. And that's not solving anything. That's adding fuel to the fire of the miscommunication in the first place, because now you leave wondering what the end result of that conversation could have been and should have been had you all been able to stay on track. And then the person who's left behind is left wondering, well, where are you going and what you getting ready to do? Because stuff got a little heated and now we're not on the same page. And then thirdly, a consequence of this ineffective communication is dissociation. And that's different from disassociation. Dissociation is now where I take my feelings, my emotions, and my thoughts completely out of the situation. I'm still physically present in here, but everything else about me has left the chat. So now my responses are, okay, yeah, head nods, shoulder shrugs, because I have taken every feeling, every emotion that I have, and I've set them on the shelf and chose to dissociate from the conversation, from the situation. And that is definitely a place that we don't want to be in our communications with one another. Because when you talk about the enemy getting busy and playing tricks on your mind of, why are you so quiet? You sure you're okay? You said everything was cool, but you're acting different. Oh, yeah, I'm fine. And we know we're not fine because there's still thoughts in our minds about what they said that caused us to dissociate in the first place. There's still thoughts in our minds about what happened in that situation that caused us to dissociate in the first place. And so now the enemy's getting ready to have a field day with our minds. And they're getting ready to have, he's getting ready to have a field day with the minds of the person that we were in conversation with. Because now there's a lot of, well, what ifs? Well, did I? Well, did they? Well, did they think that? Well, what did I say? Well, at what point of the conversation? Well, why are they so quiet? I don't feel you anymore in the midst of this conversation. Have you ever been in a situation like that where you say, I can't feel you? Where are you? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? Or have you been that person where someone said to you, I can't feel you. I don't know where you are emotionally, mentally. You don't feel present. Dissociation. So how do we avoid all of this? How do we avoid getting to this place of ineffective communication, or how do we fix that? How do we avoid potentially dealing with these consequences of ineffective communication? We have got to choose. We got to pick and choose our words, y'all. We got to pick and choose our tone. We got to make sure that, like Ephesians 4:29 says, that good things come from our lips, come from our mouths, that are used for the good and building up. And that we give grace to those who hear, who are the receiving ends of our words. And I'm not getting ready to sit here and tell you that it's going to happen every single time. We all mess up. We all have those situations where we say before we think. But as you grow and as you mature, as I grow, as I mature, we begin to stop and think about the words that come out of our mouths and how they're going to affect people who we say we love, how they're going to affect people that we care about, that we work with side by side, by people that we volunteer with, that we do ministry with, that we do life with. I've got to stop and consider, what am I saying? How am I saying it? Am I being effective in my communications? Am I saying what needs to be said at the right time? Because in the heat of the moment, communicating something that's going to add insult to injury, that's not the time. Did I pray about this conversation before I decided to come have it? Did I pray about what I was going to say to them before I said it? Did I pray about what I needed to talk to my children about, or what I needed to talk to my husband about before I went to go and have the conversation? Did I even put forth the effort to try to make sure that what came out of my mouth would be for the building up and not the tearing down? We've got a solution. And like I said, scripture is filled, Bible is filled with directives on how to make sure that we're communicating in a way that doesn't leave room for the enemy to get busy, doesn't leave room for our thoughts to start going all awry and become a devil's playground. So we have to put forth the effort to make sure that we are saying what we need to say in the proper tone. Clarity is kind. That's something that one of my coworkers says. Clarity is kind. Make sure that we're leaving no room for error, no room for miscommunication, no room for I wonders that are going to take us down a negative pathway. We got to work on our communication, especially in the age, like I started out with this, especially in the age of social media, and we're typing and texting everything. I don't know the tone, don't know the context. I got to stop and think before I respond. I hope that you all have heard something that's been a blessing to you on today, that'll even on this very day, that'll help improve your communication with your loved ones, with your coworkers, with your family, with your friends. I hope that you took away at least one nugget to make sure that we aren't creating places and spaces for the enemy to get busy and create a devil's playground in our relationships that mean the absolute most to us. I love y'all. God bless you. I hope that you come back and join us next week for our final installment of this August series, The Devil's Playground, and keep rocking and rolling with us for Summit Up Saturdays. Grace and peace.